Okay, hi everyone, I'm Gianna. I'm a first year PhD student here at Sussex, and today I'm going to be talking about using the figurative methodology to analyse the female robot. There we go. So the title of my thesis is The Figure of the Female Robot in the Age of the AI Assistant. As I said, I'm in my first year part-time, so I'm very much at the early stages of my research. But today I just want to introduce my topic very briefly and talk a bit about the methodology that I'm using. So, as Tanya has nicely set me up here, when we think of female robots, perhaps these are some of the images that might spring to mind from film and TV representations. So dating back, almost 100 years, things like Metropolis, to very recent films like Megan, kind of spanning lots of different genres, including horror, sci-fi, but also comedy and children's films. So you might be familiar with some of these already. But you might also think about some of the kind of real world technologies that we use, or you might have heard about in the media, that are also gendered as female or feminine. So thinking about virtual voice activated AI assistants like Siri and Alexa, it's estimated that about 4 billion devices around the world are embedded with some kind of voice assistant. And most of those, in fact, almost always are gendered as female. There's also examples of kind of real life female robots in the media, such as the robot Sophia, developed by Hanson Robotics. And also you might think about sex robots. I get asked a lot about sex robots, such as Harmony there on the right. But you also might think about, if you just did a quick Google search of female robot, you can tend to get images like these. So from AI generated art or stock images, but also influencing kind of subcultures and fashion and music, such as Beyonce. So the focus of my research is I'm applying the figurative methodology, which is what I'll be telling you a bit more about today, to analyse some non-fiction coverage of real-world robots and AI technologies that are gendered female. So looking at Siri, Alexa, and Sophia, I've just mentioned, and also concurrent fictional representations of female robots on screen in the period 2011 to present. Just a very brief note on the terminology I'm using. I'm using the term female robot to include both AI and robots, noting that AI generally refers to software, robots to hardware, but in cultural representations, these are often very blurry because AI is often represented in anthropomorphized form. And also just want to note that sort of female and feminine are also contested terms. But for now, I'm just saying female robot as the kind of generic term for any kind of anthropomorphized AI that has kind of culturally ascribed feminine characteristics. Why does this matter? You might be thinking, okay, there's some female robots in the media, but there's also ones that are gendered male or ones that are gender neutral or ones that are animals. Well, as we've seen, the female robot is incredibly culturally ubiquitous. And it's worth noting that AI itself is an overwhelmingly male-dominated industry, but women are sort of weirdly overrepresented when it comes to depictions of it, which is interesting in and of itself. And of course, if we don't examine these kind of cultural narratives, those fictional narratives end up kind of informing our views of real world technologies, as Tanya has just already touched on. And that means that kind of harmful stereotypes around gender, race, and class and other things can end up being perpetuated. And it can also kind of contribute to a public mistrust in technology. So just to talk to you more a little bit about the figurative methodology that I'm using. So to give you a brief overview, if you're not familiar, the figurative methodology is both a theoretical framework and a methodological approach. It's kind of been developed in the last sort of 3 decades or so in post-structuralist, postmodernist, and post-colonial feminism. Figuration itself has a much longer history, but as a kind of methodology, it's come about a bit more recently. So it's a form of discourse analysis, which tracks the repetition of figures across different texts. And it's mostly associated with a group of researchers from Lancaster University in the early noughties. But its roots in feminist theory go back to Donna Haraway, who some of you may be familiar with. And Imogen Tyler in particular is the person who kind of brought it together into a kind of concrete methodology. And it's influenced a few recent scholars in cultural studies, sociology and media studies. But in my view, it's still a very much kind of underutilized method, especially in other areas. So what do we mean by figure? Well, you might think of a figure as a person, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. According to Haraway, figuration is a material semiotic process which brings something into being. So she talks about things that are both kind of literal or real and existing in the real world, but also figurative, and that they trouble identifications and certainties. So she talks about the cyborg, the figure of the cyborg, and how that kind of disrupts binaries. But it's not just kind of about sort of humans mixed with robots. It can be kind of all different kinds of things that kind of trouble these boundaries and are both real and figurative at the same time. So she talks about things like the seed and the chip and the ecosystem. So there's a lot more I could say about Haraway and cyborgs, but I don't have time, so I'm going to just brush past that. But I did want to talk a little bit about the people who've been influenced by her. So Castaneda, for example, looked at the figure of the child and how that was kind of constructed in lots of different cultural contexts. And she talks about figures are the effects of these material semiotic processes and what they body forth. And Sarah Ahmed also talked about figures as kind of being fetishized, which kind of, so figures sort of have a life of their own. So she looks at the figure of the stranger, for example. And she also notes the kind of the role of emotions in that. So she talks about this term affective value, where certain emotions sort of stick to somebody's rather than others in very kind of gendered, race and othering ways. So you can see how this kind of figurative methodology can help to sort of unveil how certain bodies end up being sort of marginalized. Imogen Tyler wrote an essay called Chav Mum, Chav Scum, where she uses this methodology, and she kind of really defines it as an approach to media analysis. So she defines it as kind of tracking the repetition of figures across different types of media. And she talks about how it's a kind of a slipperiness between fiction and non-fiction. So you can see like comedy characters such as Vicky Pollard, which some of you might be familiar with, pictured on the right there, is a kind of a fictional character, but it ends up kind of slipping into mainstream discourse and ends up in kind of tabloid headlines and online comments and things like that. So it's kind of through this repetition of a kind of an idea or a figure that they gain this kind of emotional resonance or affective value, and it leads to kind of influencing social and political discourse. And Imogen Tyler argues that it's always expressive of some kind of underlying social crisis or anxiety. So why is this a particularly useful method for analysing the female robot? Well, firstly, robots are both material and semiotic in the sense that they exist in the world, but they also simultaneously imagined in the media as well. And there's an author called Tellot who wrote a book called Robot Ecologies, where he looks exactly at this. He looks at robots as they're constructed from, not just female robots, all robots, how they're constructed across a wide range of media text. So he describes them as like a spreadable trope, which infects other texts. So you can think of them in, all different kinds of media, film, TV, books, comic books, toys, games, and also not just from a single genre like science fiction, but also in, many, many other kinds of genres. So that's the kind of spreadability. And he also talks about how the robot expresses very frequently cultural anxiety. So that kind of mirrors what Tyler is saying. And we've also seen how other applications of the figurative methodology are quite useful for exposing gender, race, class, and other forms of otherness. Hence why I think it's a particularly useful method for analysing the female robot. So what it enables me to do in my research is kind of analyse the female robot across a wide range of media, looking at fiction, non-fiction, and real-world technologies, examining these kind of patterns of repetition, and looking in particular for the kind of the underlying resonance and how it kind of reveals anxieties or cultural anxieties and crises. And in particular, how is this constructed in a gendered way through things like fetishization and emotion. So finally, just to kind of turn to my research questions and how I'm going to be taking this forward, I'm going to be looking at how the contemporary female robot figure is constructed through repetition across lots of different cultural sites, how it's evolved in recent years with the development of AI and AI assistants specifically, what kinds of gender stereotypes are being replicated or perhaps evolved, what we can learn from existing feminist inquiry into fictional representations of female robots. There has been quite a bit of work on that specifically from things like film studies, media studies, And there's also been separately some kind of feminist inquiries recently around how how technology is influenced by gender in the real world. But what I'm hoping is that this methodology can kind of bring those two areas together and allows us to see sort of patterns of similarities and differences between those two areas. And finally, I'm hoping to kind of draw out some ethical insights from this. So, what does this show us about how and why we gender technology to begin with, and what that can show us about how we think about human sex and gender as well. That's me. Thank you very much.